So here's the objectives for today, you guys, for the first CSCS webinar. Number one is to go over the energy systems. I was telling Michelle when she hopped in here a little earlier that I'm going to introduce them as if we know nothing about them at first. I know there's a variety of levels of expertise here in this room. We have some professionals, we have some students, and so I don't want to assume that everyone's on the same page. So I will start at the basic level, but then we're going to go deeper. Okay, we're going to analyze how different sports and tasks demand different energy system contributions. Okay, then we're going to learn how to tailor our training based on predominant energy usage. So we're actually going to start to link together the needs analysis and the physiology. Okay, we're going to do that with a couple of different case studies. And then the second objective after we go through energy systems is really to give you guys some extended tools to study for your CSCS. I know this webinar series only covers probably 5% of what's in the book, just one concept from chapters here or there. And so I just want to give you guys some not only some advice on how to study, how I studied and how I help my students study, but also to just show you some resources that I have that if you want to go deeper with me in this journey, then you can take advantage of that. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the creatine phosphate system. This is what it looks like visually, okay? We've got ATP plus creatine, all right? When we have creatine in the cell and ATP in the cell, we have to remember that ATP is really the energy currency of the cell. You probably heard that way back in Bio 101. And in order to keep the very limited supply of ATP going, we have creatine phosphate. It's in the cell already. We have stores of it. In fact, if you took your creatine this morning, and usually in class, I would say, raise your hand if you took your creatine this morning, and then I would very lightly and politely shame everyone who didn't. Because it's such a good supplement, not only for muscle health, but also for brain health, we're finding out, for reducing potential brain injury and brain damage after concussion, for recovering from concussion, for cognitive ability when you're sleep deprived, which is why I've recently doubled my dose of creatine. Such a good supplement. Anyways, it's in the cell, and it's the first line of defense against ATP depletion. So as soon as your stores of ATP start to dip, which is as soon as you start to use ATP, and your creatine phosphate system kicks into gear, okay? And it's immediately repleting your ATP. All right, so when you have some ATP and it gets broken down into ADP and a phosphate group, then creatine phosphate comes along and donates its phosphate back to ADP. So now it's an ATP again, adenosine triphosphate, tri meaning 3. So when you lose that phosphate group, that's what gives you that energy, okay? Breaking that chemical bond. That release of the phosphate provides energy for the body, that chemical energy. Creatine phosphate comes along, and in that reaction, when we have creatine kinase, the catalyst in play, then creatine phosphate donates its phosphate group back to ADP, repletes it, and it becomes ATP. All right, and again, let me know if you guys have questions as I'm going, and we can go as slow or as fast as you need to. So the creatine phosphate system, we know, most of us, that it lasts for about 10 seconds. You can actually extend that a little bit with training, but after 10, maybe 12 seconds, you're completely gassed, okay? That's it. You're tapped out with the creatine phosphate system. So the time frame is short. The capacity is also very low, because even though the rate is high, which we'll talk about here in a minute, the duration is very low. So even though it's a high rate, it's a very, very low duration, and then you're done. It can only sustain the highest intensity movements for about 10 to 12 seconds. If you're going sub-maximal, let's say instead of sprinting at 100%, you're holding back just a bit, maybe you're going 95%, you could stretch that a little bit before you have to go glycolytic, but it's still a very low capacity, which is why we have our other energy systems. They all have their strengths and their weaknesses. ATP production rate, though, is very, very fast. It's the fastest. And in fact, anytime you go from basically not moving, like maybe we're doing right now in our chairs, to moving a little bit, creatine phosphate is ticking up just a little bit just to quickly replenish those ATP stores. but it really doesn't come into play unless we call on a lot of muscle mass at once, okay? Or we go sympathetic, fight or flight response, that kicks it into high gear, okay? Otherwise, if we're at rest, then it's mostly the oxidative system, which we're going to get to in a minute, okay? Now, each of these energy systems has something called a rate limiting factor. That's the factor that limits how quickly we can regenerate ATP from this system, okay? So let's apply the creatine phosphate system to sport. This is a picture of John Hack. John is a legendary power lifter. He's a modern day power lifter, meaning he's not from history. He's currently still competing. He just set new records recently, and I've gotten to train next to him and with him, which is very humbling. When you're next to a human who can just do things at a very, very elite level that you're trying to do and get better at, and then you see them and they can double or triple what you do. And it's a humbling and awe-inspiring experience. But John's super nice guy, very, very humble, soft-spoken, but he represents, and powerlifting represents, a great case study for the creatine phosphate system. The creatine phosphate system is the primary energy system for powerlifting. And it's because the event, the actual competition part of the event, lasts for less than 10 seconds. You could say the same for, let's say, the 60-meter sprints. You could say the same for the shot put, for the discus, etc. But we're going to talk about powerlifting. Okay, so let's go step by step. Okay, John is going to attempt a 1 repetition maximum deadlift. Now, as he's getting warmed up, his oxidative system and his glycolytic system are chugging along because he's getting ramped up. He has sympathetic activation and stimulation. And so it's not solely the creatine phosphate system. He has an interplay of all 3 systems. But when he actually goes for and attempts his 1RM deadlift, then it is all creatine phosphate system, okay? Because that deadlift hopefully is less than 10 seconds. I mean, I've seen some grinders of deadlifts, but hopefully they're under 10 seconds. Even if it's 5 seconds, that's a long rep. Powerlifting is not time limited. It doesn't matter how long it takes you, but as long as you get that bar up, it's a good rep. Okay, so the intensity here is maximal, which is important because it means that we're, in this case, expressing force with just about every muscle in the body. Why is that important? Well, it's because there's a huge energy demand as far as rate goes. Not so much capacity. He does it for less than 10 seconds, but the rate is very, very high. And so we're calling on the phosphagen system, okay? The ATP stores and creatine phosphate within the cell. What this means as far as fatigue and byproducts go, there's no lactic acid buildup, okay? There's no lactate production, really, that's happening. Remember that lactic acid is really sort of a misnomer. The term is very sticky. It sticks in our minds, and even though it has been shown repeatedly, time and time again, now that lactate production and hydrogen ions happen in parallel, and we're going to get to this later, but they don't, lactate does not cause hydrogen ion buildup, okay? And that's kind of the burn that you feel. But there's minimal to no lactate production and no hydrogen ion buildup in this case, okay? So some things to say about this. Or during John's training, rather, his body undergoes some training adaptations to actually get better at fueling his competition with the creatine phosphate system. What might those adaptations be? Well, he's going to have an increase in creatine kinase. Remember when we talked about the rate limiting factors, creatine kinase is the rate limiting factor in this case. He will also have an increase in type 2X fiber recruitment, okay? The fastest of the fast twitch fibers, type 2A and type 2X. Both of those actually are probably going to increase with training, and you can tell how hypertrophied he is, how swole he is, how jacked and juicy, I sometimes like to say. And that's not all type 2 muscle fibers. There's a lot of type 1 hypertrophy as well, because as we train, and this is a tangent, but we go through fiber type transitions. Okay, you can actually take a muscle fiber, train it more like its faster or slower counterpart, and it will slowly adapt to become faster or slower depending on what you're doing. And so in John's case, lifting heavy weights, lots of rest, low reps all the time. Well, most of his muscle fibers, probably genetically, they started off pretty fast, but even his slow twitch fibers are larger, have more creatine kinase, more creatine phosphate stores, probably fewer mitochondria than they did at first because of these adaptations. But that gets into a whole nother lecture that we'll have to talk about a different time. Okay, now recovery. To fully recover your ATP PC system, you need at least 3 to 5 minutes. If you really gas it and you have some neurological fatigue in there as well, let's say you do a 100-meter sprint all out, then it's really up to even 8 minutes and beyond that. Okay. But in general, for weight training and for training purposes, 3 to 5 minutes, just because 8 minutes gets to be a little bit long, then you have other systems cooling down, you might have to rewarm up, etc. Okay. Now, that's not to say he couldn't go maybe pull a slightly lighter load again within 3 minutes. Like if you've ever lifted weights and you've done singles or cluster sets, it doesn't mean you can't do it again. It just means to be fully repleted, fully restored. You do have to wait quite a while for the system. Okay. So common misconceptions about the creatine phosphate system, because it's a high intensity system, people often mix up high intensity with high effort and hard. Okay. High effort and hard are not necessarily duration limited. The creatine phosphate system is gassed after 10 seconds. So if you went and did something like 30-second sprints or Tabata intervals, especially with minimal rest, yes, you will get some training of your creatine phosphate system if you're untrained, but you're actually going to be training your glycolytic system. And so if we were doing some energy system training for John, what I want you to think about right now, and I'm not going to say it yet, I'll give you a minute, think about what type of work to rest intervals we would want to use in order to best train the creatine phosphate system, and then think about what byproduct we want to avoid building up in the bloodstream. Okay, I'm going to give you guys 1 minute to maybe jot that down, and then if anyone's brave enough to give me an answer, then I'll ask for an answer. Okay, so work to rest ratio to train the creatine phosphate system. What are we thinking? You can say it in the chat. You can just call it out.
Professor, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Milan.
I would think about doing a 10-second work, so 10-second lift or whatever type of workout I uses the energy system, the ATP PCR system.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be a sprint or a lift or a heavy lift, and then having at least 3 minutes of rest between each intervals.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's kind of laid out on this table, right? But you're absolutely right, Milan. By having the 3 minutes of rest and only 10-second duration work set, what is not building up in the bloodstream?
The lactate, not lactic
Lactate,
acid.
exactly. Lactate and by association, hydrogen ions,
Yeah.
right? Exactly. And what most people commonly would say lactic acid, but again, we might more accurately say lactate accumulation and the buildup of hydrogen ions, okay? And the burn and the fatigue associated. So those will not build up. And so what we might call that is anaerobic, meaning without oxygen, alactic, meaning without lactate buildup, anaerobic alactic training. Okay, because sometimes you could say anaerobic training, and that could be 30 seconds all out with limited rest. That's very anaerobic. You're gasping for oxygen because oxygen will not supply enough ATP for you to do that workout. Okay, you need to go anaerobic for it, but it's a different system. So to train the creatine kinase or creatine phosphate system, rather, you need to be anaerobic alactic without the buildup of lactate and hydrogen ions. Okay, very good. Another thing you could do, just thinking about work to rest ratios and really applying this, you could do sub maximal as far as duration goes. So instead of going, let's say, sprinting all out for 10 seconds, what if it was a 3-second, maybe an acceleration, like a 6-step? That's not even 3 seconds. That's like 1.5 seconds. Maybe like a 6-step or a 7-step 2-point start where we hit acceleration, walk it off, come back. Maybe you take 30 seconds, maybe you take a minute. There was no lactate buildup. And because you didn't fully gas the creatine phosphate system, then you can go again a little bit more quickly than 3 to 5 minutes. And you might get more reps at whatever skill you're building. And there might be some differentiated effects on the muscular system and the nervous system as well. Okay, so lots of different ways you could get creative with it. Trey asked, so if you're not building up lactate, when you do anaerobic training with no lactic acid buildup, then what makes you feel sore? Really good question, Trey. And so soreness is actually not due to the buildup of lactate and lactic acid, or rather hydrogen ions. That is actually responsible for the acute feeling of soreness, but more accurately called the burn in your muscles, right? So like if you go do a set of bicep curls and you go all the way to failure, that burning sensation you feel in the muscle, that's the buildup of those metabolic byproducts, hydrogen ions included. Soreness the next day is caused by damage to the actual muscle fibers themselves and calcium leakage, sarcomere or Z-line streaming that then needs to be repaired. Okay, and so training at long muscle lengths under high tension will emphasize that maybe the most out of anything. But if let's say you're doing what I just talked about, like 3-second sprints repeated, you can get sore from that, absolutely, if it's a new or novel stimulus to you. But that's going to be more due to what I just said. So any type of muscle damage that happens, especially if it's novel. And then the byproduct of hydrogen ions is cleared out fairly quickly. The Z-line streaming and then the calcium leakage, those things are going to stick around for a longer time frame. Yeah, super good question there, Trey. Okay, so moving on to the glycolytic system. The glycolytic system, we're going from very fast energy delivery and short duration, and now we're getting into still fast, but slightly less fast energy delivery. Okay, still a high rate, but not quite as high a rate as the PCR system, but a longer duration. Okay, here's what it looks like, very simplified in this figure. We have glucose and glycogen. Blood glucose is just the word for when sugar is in your blood. Okay, anytime you eat something and you digest it and it's pulled into the bloodstream, then it turns into blood glucose. It also can go to, refuel liver glycogen as well, and muscle glycogen. Glycogen just means that we have multiple glucose molecules all connected together into a chain. Okay, we might call it in food a complex carbohydrate because we have to break some of those bonds and it's slower to digest, which is good in some instances and not as good in other instances. Let's say if you need fuel very rapidly. Okay, so we get our sugar, our carbohydrate from those two different sources primarily, but the liver as well, if this was a less simplified figure. Okay, and then those go into the glycolytic system, and we're generating 2 ATP per molecule. Okay, on average. We'll see some of the actual figures later. Okay, but we also get some pyruvate, and if you have aerobic respiration, meaning that, and we're going to get into this with the oxidative system, meaning that the demand for energy is low enough that your oxidative system can supply it, okay, then we're going to be doing aerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic glycolysis, which is what we're going to talk about right now, leads to a buildup of lactate and hydrogen ions. Okay, so let's talk about that. So the time frame for the glycolytic system, and specifically the anaerobic glycolytic system, is 30 seconds to about 2 minutes. And you might be wondering, well, what about that gap? Because the creatine phosphate system ends at 10, and then this is at about 30. Well, there's an overlap of all systems at all times. The glycolytic system is really going to be peaking around 30 seconds to 2 minutes. Okay, so that's going to be the commonly cited figure that you see, or you might see some figures in textbooks just say 10 seconds to 2 minutes. Now, the ATP capacity is moderate. Okay, it's more than the PCR system, less than the oxidative system. The rate is still high. It's not very high, but it's high. Okay, and if we think about it, think about like at a track meet. I use track and field for a lot of my examples because, well, it's familiar to me, but also because track and field is so energy system dependent. Almost all of training for track and field is to enhance metabolic systems, the 3 energy pathways, and direct fitness characteristics. It's like the truest expression of physical preparedness that we have in sport. All other sport relies on fun and exciting things like a crazy amount of skill, tactics, chaos, unpredictability, interaction with other players and implements. Track and field is very linear. It's very refined and almost simplified. I don't want to mean simplified in that it's easy, but simplified in that we can actually use it for really good examples of what's happening physiologically. Okay, so now in this case, for the glycolytic system, the rate limiting factor is the accumulation of hydrogen ions, okay? The decrease in pH and then enzyme inhibition, all right? We could probably throw in there as well the availability of oxygen, but that's more due to the intensity and the demand for ATP. Okay, so when we're talking about the glycolytic system, this is a picture of Sydney McLaughlin-Levrone. I think that's her new hyphenated last name, world record holder in the 400-meter hurdles. And she insanely runs it in about 50 seconds flat, which is pretty crazy. All right. And here she is beating Femke Bol, another very, very good 400-meter and 400-meter hurdle runner from, where is she from? Poland, I think. I should know that. I think from Poland. I think that's their colors. All right. So let's say that Sydney is racing the 400-meter hurdles. Okay. Let's talk about what's happening. Okay. So the duration between 30 and 90 seconds. I mean, it's never going to be 30 seconds, but I'm just giving you the range. The range of duration of this glycolytic system. Now, if you extend past 90 seconds, it's still glycolytic and anaerobic, but we see more aerobic factors really starting to kick in because you cannot sustain as high of intensity. We're going to talk about the inverse relationship between those two in a little bit. The intensity is very high. Okay, there's some pacing, but it's mostly all out. Okay, the primary energy system, as we talked about, anaerobic glycolysis. And we have to think now about the byproducts. Again, commonly referred to as lactic acid, so you're going to hear that. And so I have it in the slide, but we know as practitioners, it's lactate and hydrogen ions, and the hydrogen ions lead to fatigue. Okay, lactate is actually great. You use it as energy. You can take it up with your lactate transporters back into the cell to be converted back into pyruvate and then used as energy, etc. But sometimes we just can't clear it fast enough. And it's also associated in parallel with hydrogen ion buildup. All right, so how would these athletes train? Well, they train to increase buffering capacity of lactate. How do you do that? Well, you train to have high lactates and force your body to deal with it. You force your body to deal with the consequences of the intensity and the duration that you injected. They have to increase their glycolytic enzymes within the muscle cells at the most basic physiological level. So when we think about how do we plan that, well, we have to think about a few different factors. One is the fuel. Are we fueling appropriately before training? We have to have some glycogen available. So things like fasted training, things like low carb diets are probably not going to be best for any athlete, really, is what research is finding. But especially for these types of athletes, they have to be fueled up. Okay. We also have to think about recovery. If they have an all-out effort, and by all out, I mean all out for a sufficient duration, and they fully gas their glycolytic system, they have to rest a long time. Okay, a long time for full lactate clearance, depending on whether they cool down and have active recovery, because that actually clears lactate and the byproducts more quickly, because now your muscles can use up some of that lactate from the bloodstream. Or if they just lie on their back, then the blood pools and they don't clear it as quickly. Okay, now that doesn't mean in training they always have to rest that long, because most of their training is not an all-out effort. With a PCR system, you can more frequently tax it fully in training and recover from it and do it again. Okay, because the global demands are not as great. The global stress on the body is not as great. If you fully tax your anaerobic glycolytic system, like, you're not going to do another one of those reps for at least 20 minutes. Okay, you're not going to really be recovered enough to do much of anything of quality and of that similar duration. Okay, so practically, we want to do, let's say we're doing some interval training. We need to do intervals that are shorter than the full duration that we're trying to compete for, and at slightly lower intensity so that we can repeat it multiple times. Okay, so this going at a slightly lower intensity still trains the system, still stresses the system, still increases the substrates, but now we don't need to spend an hour or days recovering to do it again. We can do it again in a few minutes instead of 30 minutes, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's say 2 by 300 at 90%, still very high efforts. but maybe we're resting 5 minutes or 10 minutes in between instead of doing an all-out 400 and then having to rest for 30 minutes. So the oxidative system, now we're getting into the system that has a ton of capacity, okay? We can take in any substrate, carbohydrate, protein, even fats, and we can take that into the oxidative system and churn out a ton of energy. The byproducts here are just heat, carbon dioxide, and water. Okay, so it's kind of like a clean burning, but slow system. It's like a hybrid, right? Not chemically like a hybrid or really mechanically, but functionally like a hybrid. Okay, you get less icky byproducts from a hybrid, and it can go for longer. But well, maybe not like a Tesla. Yeah, more like a Prius hybrid. But it can go for a long time. Okay, but it's slow, right? I don't know if they're. I think now Toyota's making Priuses fast and kind of sexy because they want more people to buy them and to compete with cars like Tesla. But back in the day, like if you guys remember when Priuses came out, or like Nissan Leafs, I don't think those are hybrid. I think those are fully electric, but they're not very quick. They're slow, but they're super, super efficient. And that's why they're that's why people buy them. That's what the oxidative system is like. How long can you go? How cleanly can you burn this fuel without the buildup of byproducts? Okay. Oh, I've got to hold on. Got to fix this slide really quick. Put the wrong thing there. This should say here. Let's just do this in real time. I put the wrong specifications. Okay, so the time frame. We're just going to build this in real time. The time frame is 3 minutes to upwards of 3 hours. Really, or really, I could just say even anything greater than 3 minutes. Okay, anything greater than 3 minutes. The ATP capacity is very high because we can generate a ton of it from very little substrate. The production rate is low. Okay, the production rate is low because we require oxygen, and because our mitochondrial systems cannot churn out the ATP at quite as fast of a rate. The rate limiting factor in this case is oxygen delivery and mitochondrial enzyme capacity. Okay, more specifically, and I don't think you'll need to know this for the CSCS exam, but isocitrate dehydrogenase, that's the rate limiting enzyme there. All right, so a good example of this is David Roche. If you don't know who he is, he just set a new record for the Leadville 100. Absolute beast of not only a runner, but also of a sports scientist. His wife and him are kind of like a coaching slash competition duo. She coaches him. He also coaches other people as well. They both do a lot of sports science and endurance science, and so they post all their training, which is really cool. So you can see all of the different unique and evidence-based ways that he trains and very creative ways that he trains. And a lot of his training posts, actually, I really appreciate because they point back to these principles. Okay, so let's think of this scenario. He's running the Leadville 100. David is running the Leadville 100. Let's say he's in mile 3. Okay, think about what's happening. He hasn't had a lot of time yet for fatigue to really build up because he's going at such a relatively slow pace. I mean, in real life, for 100 miles, this is a blistering pace. But relative to Sydney McLaughlin-Varone, who we just looked at, it's very, very slow. But that's because the rate of ATP production, it has to be slow. Also, when we think about things like this, there's an interaction with the mechanical and the physical components. We can't just think metabolics, although that's what we're talking about today, but we could go on several tangents around the limitations of the musculoskeletal system to handle the intensity for that duration of time, okay? Because it just can't. Like the rate of eccentric force and loading when he's going downhill or with every step or every impact, the force production, the increased energy required to produce higher forces to go faster, all of that stuff would also be a limitation. Okay, so the primary energy system, as we know, is oxidative. The substrates, mostly fats and carbs, depending on the intensity. So if he's going, in this case, it's really anything, to be honest. It could be mostly fats because it's low enough intensity. But at the elite level, he will have some fats just because he's doing this for like a long time, right? 15 hours. But carbs are actually still going to be the best source of fuel. And specifically, glucose and fructose, a mixture of the two, because fructose, it is absorbed differently. It goes through the liver. And so we have two different delivery pathways, and we can actually get more into the bloodstream without getting GI issues. If you've trained that way, it's a very important consideration for marathon and above. Okay. Oh, I noticed our timer ran out. Are you guys still with me? Yeah, you're still with me. Okay. Um, substrates, carbs, and fats, discussion points here to be aware of. Training adaptations are going to be in order to increase mitochondrial density and also the health of those mitochondria to make them more efficient and the number of mitochondria, okay? And also to increase capillarization. Those are just two of the many training adaptations. But when we're thinking about incurring those adaptations, we want to think about basically zone 2 training and below. Zone 2 in a 5-zone model, which we can go over in at another time, is running under the intensity at which you begin to accumulate lactate and hydrogen ion buildup. So running under that is going to be zone 2, and then below that is zone 1. So he does a lot of training in those zones. It doesn't mean he doesn't train higher than that, because he does. I've seen his Strava, but most of it's going to be lower than that. Okay. If he were to run at higher intensities, he would require a greater percent of carbohydrate utilization. It wouldn't be as what we call carbohydrate sparing. The thing around carbohydrate sparing, and you might hear that term during marathon training, is that we cannot ingest as much carbohydrate as we use during high intensity exercise. And when I say high intensity in this context of endurance sport, I mean running all out for that distance, pushing your own limit at that distance and at an elite level. Okay, so I don't mean high intensity like doing a heavy back squat or a sprint. High intensities as in giving it 100% for the distance. So we use more carbohydrate than we can really refuel. And so because of that, we want our oxidative system to be super, super efficient and utilizing our body's fat stores, of which we have much more energy availability. Okay, an order of magnitude more than our carbohydrate stores. Okay, carbohydrate depletion, which is what we're getting at. If you've ever heard the term bonking, bonking is when you completely exhaust blood glucose and your carbohydrate stores are so tapped out that the body is not able to quickly push more glucose into the bloodstream and then into the necessary cells. And so bonking is when you just like hit complete motivation, rock bottom, energy output, ability to even coordinate your body. Your brain starts getting fuzzy, and it's not a really fun place to be. It's really hard to push through quote bonking or hitting the wall in a marathon or an ultra marathon like this. And so that's why fueling strategies are so important. Okay, for his training, as I mentioned, steady state runs, tempo training, hiking, even working on fueling strategies. You can even see two fuel bottles in his hands as he's going. All of those things highly, highly important. Okay, so to really sum it all up, and again, we're covering the basics today. To sum it all up, we've talked about the 3 energy systems: phosphagen, glycolytic, oxidative. We've looked at duration from 0 to 10 seconds, 30 to 90 seconds, or maybe up to 3 minutes, and then above 3 minutes for the oxidative system. We looked at recovery needs. How long do you have to recover after maximally exhausting that system? Okay, and then finally, training styles. The training style is a generality, and it's also not the only way that they would train, but maybe the primary way that these people would train. Okay, so for the creatine phosphate system, heavy lifting and low reps for a power lifter. If it was a sprinter, it would be short reps and max effort, max speed. For the glycolytic system, sprint intervals lasting longer than 10 seconds, but shorter than the actual race duration. And then for the oxidative system, distance running, endurance style training. Okay, so tempo training and below down into zone 2 and even zone 1. But let's move on then to the next section, okay? So the last couple slides for the energy systems that I wanted to cover, I wanted to show them to you in this graph format, okay? So this graph shows energy output on the y-axis and time on the x-axis, all right? And you see the different colored lines denoting the different energy systems. The reason why I have this here is because I wanted you to see when each of the energy systems sort of peaks. If you were to do, this is not a continuous event. Well, it could be continuous if you went all out from the beginning and didn't pace yourself. So let's say, and this is terrible. This sometimes we do this in the lab. We ask people to come in and we say, hey, we're going to have you run as long as you can or cycle as long as you can. The only thing is you can't pace yourself. Okay, so it's not a time to exhaustion. It's a go all out from the start and then keep going all out until you literally can't go anymore. And then that would produce a graph like this. Okay, because what they would be doing then is maximally exhausting their creatine phosphate system and ATP stores first. Okay, and then after that first 10 seconds, you're going to see the power or the work rate fall off dramatically down to a level that it's going to be a quick drop and then a slower drop as the glycolytic system is now kicking into gear, and they're able to sort of sustain that. But fatigue is building up, hydrogen ions are building up, and those are going to start to limit their outputs. Okay, and then they're going to fall off to something that they can actually sustain for a little bit longer at around the 30 to 60 second mark. As a glycolytic system is fully exhausted, they're experiencing a ton of fatigue, and the aerobic system is now the primary energy system because the first two have been totally gassed. Okay, and so that's it's brutal, but that's how we get a graph like this. Okay, and so I just wanted you to see the time course of that and when each of them peaks. And so you can see we're not really switching them on or off. It's not like you can just switch between them. They're actually all active all the time. It's just more the percent of ATP that each of them is generating for you, or the percentage of overall energy that each of them is generating. Okay, and here is actually another example of kind of the same thing, a little bit more of a simplified curve. But what I like is the overall energy curvature that you see there at the end. And in here, they're differentiating ATP from creatine phosphate in those first two curves. But we can see the overall energy availability as time extends out. This is a longer time scale on this graph, even all the way out to 8 hours. Okay. It's at the bottom where it says intensity. That's a percent intensity related to functional threshold power, which is a cycling term. Okay, and that's why we see wattage on the left-hand side, because cyclists are very concerned about the average or the max watts that they can output, depending on if they're endurance cyclists or track cyclists. So let's go through this question. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through with the question, each of the responses, and then we'll talk about the answer there at the end, okay? And that should hopefully give us all time to think about it. All right, so question number 1, during a 90-second all-out rowing test, and actually we just had an Olympic canoe kayak athlete here in the lab, and we did something very similar to this. So during a 90-second all-out rowing test, which athlete would most likely experience earlier performance decline, okay, a drop-off in performance due to metabolic fatigue, and why? Okay, an athlete with predominantly type 2X fibers. Okay, and why would they experience it? Well, they would experience fatigue due to rapid glycolytic metabolite accumulation. Okay, we have to parse through those words, and poor oxidative support. So that's potential answer number 1. Number 2, an athlete with predominantly type 1 fibers due to slower ATP production and reduced lactate tolerance. Or 3, an athlete with balanced fiber types due to early phosphagen depletion and inefficient buffering capacity. This one is a doozy, and I wrote it that way on purpose just to see where we're all at. Okay, so I'm not going to go into the answer right away. I'm going to be silent here for like 90 seconds, let you guys think about it, reread the questions. What I teach my students to do, and then I promise I'll shut up here in a minute. What I try to tell them to do is look at the question as if it's a mystery. You're a detective and you're looking for all the clues relative to the answer. Okay, sometimes questions are highly intuitive. You can basically skim it and know the answer, but then you want to reread it to be sure. Other times, questions like this one, you have to parse it out word by word, phrase by phrase. Make sure that you know exactly what it's asking and exactly what each of these answers is suggesting. Okay, so take your time, go ahead and answer on your own. All right, hopefully everyone has made a pick. What I want you to do, you don't have to do this, but either write it down to hold yourself accountable, or let me know in the chat what you thought it was, and then I'll answer. Nice. I like where your head's at, Milan. Oops, I skipped right to it. Okay, so Milan is absolutely correct, you guys. The correct answer is A. All right, and hopefully you arrived at that same answer. If you didn't, then let me explain. So the correct answer is A, because what this is asking is a few things. One, it's a 90-second all-out test. Okay, so immediately we should be thinking, okay, that's a glycolytic system. And that's actually at kind of one of the more extreme ends of the glycolytic system. Okay. Number two, it's asking about which would experience an earlier performance decline, meaning earlier in their test, their 90-second test, when are they going to be rapidly declining, okay, sloping downward due to metabolic fatigue, and why? All right, let's rule out B and C now that we know that it's A. For C, it says an athlete with balanced fibers due to early phosphagen depletion and inefficient buffering capacity. Well, actually, an athlete with balanced fibers is going to have decent phosphagen stores and decent buffering capacity. So the second part of that answer is not entirely correct, okay, which is why I would rule it out first. The other reason is we'll find out in a second because I'll compare it to number A or to letter A. B, if we look at an athlete with predominantly type 1 fibers due to slower ATP production, which that part's true, and reduced lactate tolerance, that part could be true and it could not be true depending on what the word tolerance means. Tolerance could mean your ability to continue performing with high lactate in the bloodstream. Think about the 400-meter runners again, or maybe even an 800-meter runner. They have to put out high outputs even though lactate is very, very high. They have to have a high a maximal lactate production that they can handle, okay? And so if it was talking about that, then that part of it wouldn't be true. If it was instead talking about tolerance and meaning clearance, which is the word I would have used if that's what I meant, then this athlete could clear lactate probably better than the other two. But see, the thing is, their performance is not going to be very high at the start of this 90-second all-out interval because they're type 1 predominantly. They cannot produce very much force, and therefore their performance will be low but steady the whole time. They're not going to fatigue very early. Okay, and then the correct answer is the athlete with the fast twitch muscle fibers, because they can put out a very high power output, higher than the max of the other two, and because they have higher to fall from, and because their fibers are less fatigue resistant, they will be fatiguing earlier. Okay. All right, I'm going to move on to the next one, but raise your hand or let me know in the chat if you have specific questions about that. Okay, so let's go on to question number 2 then. An endurance athlete with a high VO2 max shows early reliance on carbohydrate metabolism. Okay, so this means that early in their training or their competition, they're switching from more fats to more carbohydrate. RER, which is a measure of the ratio of substrates used for utilization of energy, their RER is over 1 at 60% of VO2 max. Okay, an RER of over 1 means a reliance on carbs. Under 1, like 0.9, 0.8, maybe even 0.7, means that you're more relying on fat oxidation and you're fat adapted. Okay, so what does this suggest about their physiological profile? Well, and hopefully I didn't just give it away with my explanation right there. Okay, so does it suggest an excess reliance on anaerobic glycolysis due to an underdeveloped phosphagen system? Does it suggest an undeveloped fat oxidation capacity? And inefficient mitochondria, or does it suggest limited glucose availability due to low glycogen stores and overtraining syndrome? I'm going to give you 90 seconds again to think about it on your own. And after that, I'll call for answers in the chat. Okay, what do you guys think the answer is? Go ahead and respond in the chat. You can respond just to me or you can respond to the group. Either one's fine. Don't be afraid to be wrong. I always tell my students, fail forward or fail fast. Move fast, break things. Get it wrong, go out on a limb. All right, a couple folks think it's B. Let us see. Oh, you can see the answer on the screen. That's a dumb professor moment. Thanks, Milan. I could have sworn that I made it animate to come in after, but hey, that's that's a stupid me moment. Well, you're correct. Answer B. So undeveloped fat oxidation capacity and mitochondrial inefficiency. Here's why. In case you knew the answer, which you did because it was on the screen, but you didn't know why it was the answer. Okay, so when we're talking about RER, and this comes up in the text when it's talking about VO2 max and those types of measures. This is something that you cannot really measure unless you're collecting oxygen. So if you're doing a VO2 max test and you have a metabolic cart and you have the mask on, it measures the amount of CO2 versus oxygen in the inspired and expired air. That's why the mask has like an in valve and an out valve to it. And the metabolic cart actually has already like analyzed the amount of that in the ambient air. Okay, so it could compare the differential before you breathe in and after you breathe in of that oxygen, and then it can tell how much carbohydrate is being expired. Which carbohydrate expiration as you breathe it out is directly related to the amount of carbohydrate that you're using. Sorry, did I say carbohydrate before? CO2 expiration is directly related to the amount of carbohydrate usage. Okay, and so having an RER of greater than 1 would say, hey, we're relying on carbohydrate pretty early in this session. Why is that a bad thing? Well, remember we talked about carbohydrate sparing in something like a half marathon or a marathon. We want to rely on fats as long as possible and at as high of intensities as possible. It doesn't mean that we should do low carb, fat adapted types of diets for our elite athletes, because that's sort of like I don't know, it's kind of like a backwards approach, putting the cart before the horse. Instead, we should try to spare the carbohydrate that we have and be able to ingest more carbohydrate during that event. Okay, and so in this case, with this athlete, they have an undeveloped fat oxidation capacity and mitochondrial inefficiency. What they should do is just more aerobic training. That's going to improve their ability to oxidize fat. And they don't have to go on a low carb diet for that. They don't have to do, crazy no carb training. Although some cutting edge and very elite athletes and cutting edge coaches and sports scientists sometimes do fasted training or low carb training intentionally to stimulate that. But then the rest of their training environment is in a carbohydrate rich environment. Okay, so you could use it as a tool, but maybe not as a lifestyle. Okay, hopefully that made sense. Let me know if it didn't make sense. Okay, question number 3. Okay, during repeated 10-second sprints with 30 seconds of rest, okay, 10 on, 30 off, which of the following best describes the shift in energy system contribution over time? All of these questions, I intentionally made them a little bit harder than basic recall. Okay, is it increased reliance on oxidative metabolism due to elevated oxygen debt and delayed lactate clearance? Right? Think about that for a second. Increased reliance on aerobic oxidative metabolism due to oxygen debt and delayed lactate clearance. B, decreasing phosphagen contribution, increasing glycolytic resistance reliance due to incomplete creatine phosphate resynthesis. Or C, stable phosphagen dominance through all sprints due to short explosive duration. Okay, so which of those best describes how the energy system contribution changes over time? Recall the graphs that we looked at with intensity versus duration. Recall the time frames of each of those energy systems, and recall the amount of rest that you need for each of those energy systems to fully replete. All right, we have some answers in the chat. Thank you guys for participating. Awesome, awesome, awesome. I love it. And also, if you're driving or if you can't, get to the chat, totally get it. Don't tell anyone, but sometimes when there's Zoom meetings, like for faculty things, sometimes I'm doing other things during them as well. But listening in for all the key information. Awesome. Okay, let's see if you're correct. Let's see if it is B. Correct answer is B. Really good job. Okay, I'm very happy that we've seen a lot of correct answers on these last three because they're not easy questions. Okay, they're not easy questions. So the correct answer is that decreasing phosphagen contribution, or sorry, let me read the question again. During this exercise, which best describes the shift in energy system contribution? Okay, decreasing phosphagen contribution as we go. Correctly identified, because remember that curve of super high ATP PC contribution at first and it falls off very rapidly. Increasing glycolytic reliance due to incomplete CP resynthesis because we're not resting long enough, right? The creatine phosphate system takes 3 to 5 and maybe even 8 minutes to fully replete. And so we're only giving it 30 seconds. This is why, for instance, if you have a 100-meter sprinter, 60-meter sprinter, even 200-meter sprinter, they have a very heavy reliance on the CP system. It's not going to be trained sufficiently with insufficient rest. This is a great conditioning setup. This is a great, like metabolic conditioning, high intensity type conditioning. It could even be used sparingly to condition your sprint athletes or your strength and power athletes, especially those in a team sport setting where they actually do have to do repeated sprint. Let's think of like a football player, right? A wide receiver or even offensive line. Okay, they have different demands in the game, but both of them have to run the play according to the huddle, how long they take in the huddle, how quickly they're trying to get the snap going, and so they have to have repeated sprint ability or repeated effort ability, right? And so this type of conditioning, while it may not be the best for improving solely the creatine phosphate system, it could still be a tool for those athletes whose sport only lasts on average 6 seconds. Like a football play is on average, I think, about 6 or 7 seconds, but they have to do it again and again, right? So we're starting to get into a lot of the nuances of training. And so you guys, that brings me to the end of, and we went way over time like a typical professor, like I tend to do. That brings me to the end of this energy system talk for today. I want to transition now from energy systems to talking about how I advise people to study for the CSCS exam and how I did it when I was a student, to give you guys just some tips for going forward. And of course, you can hop on to the next webinars, but then I also have some extended study options for you, okay? So the way that I studied for the CSCS exam in undergrad was I first took the CSCS prep course that my university offered. It was called Strength and Conditioning. I now teach the equivalent of that course at the university where I teach, and some of you already know that. And it's a great way to prepare for it. The problem was that when I was in undergrad, our professor didn't, well, let me say it this way. Our professor was brilliant and he was a physiologist and an anatomist, but he wasn't a strength and conditioning coach. And so he actually brought in somebody from the community. He was thinking ahead. He was thinking about what can I do best for my students? And he partnered up with a very good, a very well experienced strength coach and personal trainer from that area. Now, the two of them co-taught that course, and that coach actually went on to become one of my first mentors, who then helped me to develop as a practitioner myself. And so that is how I passed the CSCS exam at first, is that I had not only a teacher and a textbook, but a guide and a mentor. So what I tell my students to do is, yes, we read the textbook. That's where all of the information from the test comes from. Then the next step is to take those concepts, and yes, you have to memorize them. That's part of it, but that's only the first step. So create flashcards, quiz yourself on quiz questions. If you don't have those available, then I'm creating some of those resources here, and I do have some that I uh, give out, or I have some that you can either purchase, or if you join a course, you'll have access to them. But those are kind of the first steps. The really important step is having that mentor to say, hey, here's what the textbook says, but here's how I actually apply it, to bridge the gap between the theory and the evidence and then the actual application of it. And what we see in CSCS failure rates, actually, which have been very high in the past few years, one, because the test got harder, and two, I think because more people are trying to take the test without actually having experience in the field, which is both a good and a bad thing. It's a good thing, actually. I'll start with a good, because I think more people are trying to speak the language of training and development because they want to be able to interface with strength and conditioning, or because they know that their athletes are returning to play, like let's say they're a physical therapist, or let's say that their kids are returning to sport if they're an occupational therapist, et cetera, et cetera. And they want to be able to prepare them for those demands. So they have to understand them, right? So that's a good thing. The bad thing is that without that experience, well, it's really hard to put these things into practice, right? And so that's what I would encourage all of you, and all what I tell my students to do. Have somebody who's been there and done it before, who implements it on a daily or weekly basis to guide you through those concepts. Okay. And so I wanted to share with you guys a couple things that I have in store, and that could be an option for you. Or I know some of you on this call have already told me that you are signed up to take the exam soon. And so the way that this would be relevant to you is that this you might already be taking the CSCS exam soon, but you might know somebody who doesn't have access to a course. Maybe they didn't do their undergrad in exercise science. Maybe they need to improve their knowledge and have a mentor to guide them. And so you could send this to them, right? So this course, I'm going to be launching it on April 28th. That's when we're going to start. It's going to be one-on-one calls like this, where we talk through it in real time, okay, to answer your questions. But then outside of the calls, based on whatever the sticking points were and whatever the feedback is from that chapter, I'll be creating specific study guides, study tools, quiz questions, just like the quiz questions we went through today, so that you can actually take those hardest concepts and not only understand them, but apply them into sport, into training, into decisions for your athletes, whether the ones under your care or the ones that you might have under your care in the future. Okay. And so that's really what I promise in this course. I also have a pass guarantee. And what that doesn't mean you're going to absolutely pass on your first try, even though my in-person students right now, as far as those that go and take the CSCS exam, we have a 100% passing rate, which I'm very, very proud of. But we also have really smart students. And so I know that 100% pass rate won't be there for very much longer, which is why I'm bragging about it now while I can. But what my pass guarantee means is that if you don't pass on the first try, I will continue working with you until you do pass. Okay. And I'll enroll you automatically and for free into the next cohort of this class, because some people just take a little bit more time. Okay. But I'm not here just to fill up courses or just to, you know, I don't know, make this thing, launch off. What I'm here for is to see people get certified so that they can go serve athletes. It's one of the most satisfying, rewarding things in the world to be able to take an athlete from good to better to best, right? To see them maximize their potential. And I've enjoyed and been very blessed to be able to do that. And I'm also very blessed to be able to see students and professionals change their lives by getting certified so that they can go get the GA ship or go get the job. I just had someone DM me yesterday like, hey, I'm having trouble getting my first GA position because I'm not certified, right? I want to change that. And so that's why I have this pass guarantee. Now, if you're already taking the exam though, and you send this to somebody, then I do give out referrals. So if somebody signs up for the course and joins the course and is going through it because you referred them, then I'm going to kick $50 your way just to say, hey, thank you for helping this person out. and for getting them into the course. Okay, it's kind of like a finder's fee. So, if you still need to take the exam, let's say you go find 10 people, they all sign up, then, the course is almost free for you. Okay, there is a lot of value in this course. When I added it all up, okay, with all of the sessions that are involved, it came out to, if I had to put a value on everything, it came out to around $2,500, $2,600. I plan on selling it for far cheaper than that. I plan on selling it for about $1,600. So I think incredible value, right? But because it's the first time, the first cohort, I've reduced that down again, down to 600. Why am I doing that? Well, one, because I want to fill the course out, right? And I think there's tremendous value here. And number two, because you do have to be a little bit brave to join the course that I'm launching for the first time. Now, I do have I think, a really good track record of preparing people for the exam, but it's the first time I'm doing it in this modality. Just send me a message right now in chat, send me a DM on Instagram, email me and just say, hey, I'm ready to sign up. But yeah, if you're ready, if like, hey, I'm ready, I want to start, I want to pass the CSCS in 90 days, that's the other thing. 12 weeks long. We're going to get through the whole thing and you're going to be ready to take it. So if that's you and you're ready to take the leap, please check that out. If you're not ready yet, no worries. I want to see you on the next webinar. I want to see you, interacting with the material. I do have some free resources, so you can reach out for those. But hey, guys, thanks for being here. That's all that I have for you for today. And I'm going to end it there, but give some time for more questions. I know we've paused along the way, but what questions do you guys have?